Hey guys, this is Bearboy1990, and today I kind of want to talk about establishment politics and what that means. And so, establishment politics is basically a socio-political philosophy of centrism at its finest, I guess. And centrism is not to be confused with moderation. It's not the same thing. Centrism is this idea that you have an ideal center and then you have extremities on, the left and right. The problem with that way of thinking is it's based less on objective facts and reality and more based off of beliefs and opinions. It's very much an opinion position. To be a moderate on a political position is not necessarily means that you don't disagree with those the political arguments or political ideologies. It just means that you don't believe fully in them. That you think that you need to take a break and hit the brakes every once in a while when you're thinking about the ideology, because you know that there's a chance that it can be wrong. So that's the difference between moderates and centrists. Centrists believe that there's an ideal center of political ideologies, and that's the goal that we need to reach in the society. And that's exactly what Bill Clinton believed in, and a lot of the boomer Democrats and Republicans believe in this idea of centrism, reaching a common cause. The problem with that way of thinking is that it's just not logical. There are some cases where you're either right or you're wrong. So take global warming, for instance. Global warming is a scientific problem. It's a scientific reality. There's no middle ground on that. Either you're contributing to global warming or you're combating global warming. Okay, that's just it. And it's because there's a natural process that's happening. Dumping carbon in the atmosphere leads to the planet warming. Why? Because carbon traps heat. These are basic scientific facts. There's no middle ground on that. So why do we have centrist politicians wanting to, compromise on these issues instead of just implementing policies that reduce carbon emissions? Well, the reason for that is because there's an impulse within establishment politics to reach a quorum. And the reason why this impulse is there is because of the Cold War and because of World War II. I know it seems like a little bit of a leap, but let's just take a look at what happened in most of the Western industrialized worlds after World War II. World War II showed that if you have a weak central polity, there's chances that radical elements on the fringes of the left and right have a chance of taking power. So this is one of the reasons why Nazism won out in Germany and why fascism won out in Italy. It's not because Nazis were the largest political party. They weren't. They made up of 33% of the population of Germany's electoral voters. But that was about it. So how did a party that only got 33% of the vote win overall power in the German Reichstag? Well, there's a simple solution to that. The right-wing parties that were not as big as the Nazi Party, created a coalition with him, with Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, in a hope that they'd be able to gain the majority in the Reichstag, so that they could control policy and create legislation that were more appealing to them and their constituents. The problem with that is that that's exactly what the Nazis wanted, and they were able to manipulate the system and con the conservative and right-wing elements that existed in Germany to basically hand them increasingly more and more power, and they used that to marginalize the left wing, but also to marginalize the right wing. And as a result, you got a very strange coalition where you have mainstream socialists supporting Nazis because the Nazis were supporting spending. They were supporting building infrastructure. They were supporting rebuilding the industries. I mean, we forget that the first 3 years of Hitler's administration was basically economic reforms and massive investment in public education, skills training, and reindustrialization that put people to work, that raised the standard of living for most Germans. So that's what happens when you don't have an establishment. That's basically the thought that's into this. And so whatever happens, left centrists and right centrists must maintain the majority of power, lest the communists or the fascists rise again. The problem with that line of thinking is that you basically sacrifice logic to this. Because just with the case of global warming that I was talking about, what you're doing is you're trying to force a radical sense of centrism in the polity, where you're trying to create equality for both political parties and their ideologies and their beliefs, but more importantly, their policies. And that's a problem. Okay? Global warming is not a policy issue that both sides are equal on. one doesn't agree that global warming is happening and is rejecting scientific facts, the other group is accepting that global warming is happening and is accepting scientific facts. There's no equation there. They're not equitable. They're not on equal footing. One's wrong, objectively wrong, and one's correct. Now, whether or not the policy solutions of the people who believe in global warming are going to be effective or not, that's something for debate. That's okay to talk about. But what's not okay is to create a false equivalency between climate change deniers and climate change believers. Because even that word, believer, is wrong. Because it's not that I believe that climate change is happening. I know climate change is happening because there's scientific evidence proving that it's happening. It's like, I know gravity exists. Why? Because I can pick up any object and it's going to fall to the ground. I know it exists. It's not a matter of I believe it exists. I know it exists. But that's the kind of centrist kind of language we now have adopted in this country. We got to use words like believe and feel instead of I know and I think. That's because centrism is an illogical philosophy, and it's designed to maintain a quorum, a status quo. These are naturally conservative positions, and not conservative in an American sense or in a political sense, but conservative in a status quo sense. These political establishment parties, the Republican Party and Democratic Party in the United States as examples, are in place not because they actually really care about, I just broke my voice a little bit, not because they actually care about implementing policy decisions, but because they're in positions of power to maintain and make sure that the economic institutions that we have in this country are maintained and protected, that the laws that are in regards of labor laws and in relation to the corporate world are maintained. So the reason why I say this is born out of the Cold War is that in the Cold War we had the rise of the Red Scare in the United States. And the United States used to be a nation that actually had quite a bit of, plurality when it came to political ideology. There were a lot of people in the United States that identified themselves as economic populists or were borderline socialists. They were pro-trade unions. They were pro-labor. We had a labor movement in the United States at the time. But you also had other organizations that were not necessarily labor movements, but were also civil rights movements. They didn't appeal to mainstream ideology. I mean, today, the establishment, both political parties want to own Martin Luther King. But Martin Luther King was not an establishment figure. In fact, he was the antithesis of it. So my point is that the Cold War generated this sense of conformity, and it forced the Democratic Party and the Republican Party to kind of come up with an understanding of who and what can run for who, what, where, and why of running for office. So the Democratic Party began to conform, and the Republican Party began to conform, and very quickly people like Henry Wallace, who was the vice president for FDR for most of his time as president, were marginalized. Even though he was a mainstream, die-in-the-wool Democrat, he was a New Dealer. He just wasn't pro-military. He wasn't pro-militarization. He argued extensively for demilitarizing the United States after World War II. And he made the argument that we want to do this because the Soviets think that we still are out to get them. I mean, why are we keeping troops on their borders? I mean, why do we see them as the threat? Why do we see them as the enemy? I mean, they were our ally in the war. They never did anything they said they wouldn't do. And every single time we've negotiated them, they've kept their word. I mean, Stalin never promised that Poland was going to have free elections. He never agreed to that. He never said that, yeah, that's what I'm going to do, and then reneged on it. He never said Poland was going to be a free, independent country. That's just simply it. So, why did all of a sudden Joseph Stalin become this evil figure and the next Hitler? Well, one, Joseph Stalin was a bloody tyrant. He really was that, and it's kind of hard to shake that image. But the impact that had in the United States populace and the fear that it generated in this idea that Soviets are coming for you and that communists are everywhere allowed the establishment Democrats, the establishment of the Democratic Party and the establishment of the Republican Party to kind of purge their parties of these fringe ideologies that existed in their party. I mean, when you talk about fringe ideologies in the Republican Party, people tend to think of the Ku Klux Klan and hard right-wing alt-right figures. But that's not the case. Back in the day, alternative Republican figures were people that were New Dealers or at least were interested in implementing social reforms that would have benefited people. They were less interested in the pro-corporate New England, New Yorker, Republican establishment politics. And they were more interested in implementing reforms that would have benefited people. I mean, politicians like William Borah, who was a progressive from Idaho, who was an isolationist and tended to have some racist tendencies to him, was still a progressive that wanted to implement reforms and empower the people in the state of Idaho and empower the people of America. And he believed you did that through economic reform and through political reform. Well, people like William Borah are a threat to the establishment of the Republican Party because he doesn't hold the same opinions as they do. He's not interested in their version of conservatism. The same thing about Henry Wallace, who was, once again, a figure in the Democratic Party that was a progressive. They didn't want people like him in the Democratic Party. Why? Because both William Borah and Henry Wallace were not interested in maintaining some kind of liberal hegemony in the world. They were interested in taking care of America. And yeah, we'd have allies, and we'd support our allies, and we'd invest in our ally countries. Now, if this is beginning to sound more and more similar to the situation that we're in right now, when you look at people like Bernie Sanders, and you look at people like Donald Trump, that should not be surprising. Now, I don't want to equate the two together, because they're different, very different from one another. Just like Henry Wallace and, William Borah are very different people that had different political views, but also shared some similar political views. The point is that they were anti-establishment populists that wanted to implement reform and basically break down the power cycle that existed in Washington, forcing it to be open with the rest of the polity that exists in the country. That's a threat if you're an establishment figure, because that, they argue, is the reason why Nazism came into power. Not the fact that the establishment party in the Weimar Republic, the establishment system in the Weimar Republic, was incompetent, implemented austerity, and raised taxes at the same time as an economic recession and depression began to settle in. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that the Nazi Party was a fringe, going-nowhere party in 1928. But by 1933, it now had a damn near a third of the population of Germany supporting it. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the representation of failure of establishment politics. Why? Austerity is a stupid idea. The idea that you cut government spending in the middle of a depression is basically pulling even more money out of the economy. Okay, this is the idea that, if you cut government spending, okay, and you cut taxes, 20 years from now, we are all paying less in taxes. And so that means I have money now. I have more money than I thought. So I'm going to take my money, I'm going to go to IKEA, I'm going to buy, a TV stand or a new bed or a new mattress, and that's going to solve the economy. It's all solved now. Businesses are now getting more and more money. But the problem with that idea is that public money is now taken out. You're cutting government employees, so you have more people who are off who are no longer have employment. And those benefit systems are there to basically try to stabilize the healthcare market, are taken away. So you can see this becomes a vicious cycle. Well, that's what was happening in Germany. Okay, austerity was being implemented. Tax cuts were happening. The problem with that, but then there was less and less to go around. Germany was going further and further into debt. Germany was handling problems very poorly because they tried they tried raising taxes as they implemented austerity. Well, that, of course, is going to create a very negative backlash, because what's happening is that money that was coming into these communities were being shut off, and now more money is being taken out of these communities. I mean, people forget that from basically 1923 to about 1930, the Weimar Republic was an economically stable and prosperous nation. Germany had recovered from World War I. I mean, there's this silver age or this renaissance of German culture that happened in the Weimar Republican years. And you actually had good government policies that were being implemented. But the moment the recession and then the eventual depression happened and was fully implemented in Germany, the Germans government decided to basically throw all understanding out the window and adopt a very austere and very ultra-conservative position when it came to government spending, when it came to the tax system. And it's not shocking that the people who were impacted by it were the people who were most vulnerable in the economy. And they colluded with the Nazi Party, or at least became sympathetic to the Nazi Party. Because you know what? If your town is going to shit, okay, and all you're hearing from your politicians is how great everything is going to be once these tax increases happen and the government has money to spend again. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see what happened. Okay, very systematically, the Nazi Party in Germany became increasingly popular. Now, that's the failure of establishment politics. So, if established politicians want to, make the argument that we need to have establishment centers that basically force the nation to remain in what they consider a rational center that the nation's supposed to be in, so we don't see the rise of communism and fascism, well, they have to act responsibly. They got to make sure that the proper investments are being made. Otherwise, naturally, people are going to be more radicalized. And it's not because they don't have agency. In fact, it's the reason why they become more radicalized. If I live in a community where I see my neighborhood going more and more to shit, my roads are shit, I see more and more meth addicts on my neighborhood, and fewer jobs, I'm going to naturally be more pissed off. I'm going to be naturally more prone to believe that the government doesn't have my interests at heart. Because it doesn't. And this is the great Achilles heel of establishment politics. It's naturally going to go into the favor of what establishment is at the time. And so what is establishment right now? Neoliberal, pro-corporate, out the yin-yang politics. They're all about making sure that businesses are profitable and that taxes are low. And then the monetary and fiscal policies is about making sure government doesn't go too far into debt, and that for every amount of dollar spending that the government finds to spend, they got to cut it from somewhere. Well, that's stupid management. Here's the difference between the state of Texas and the United States. The state of Texas doesn't print its own currency. So, I for the life of me, don't understand why austerity is such a popular idea in the Western world, except for the fact that both political parties, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and the establishment parties that exist in Europe, believe in austerity because they believe in neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is just traditional classical economic thinking that thinks that tax increases or a economically solvable government is what bondholders are concerned about. And these bondholders that want to buy your public debt are concerned if you get too much public debt, except for the fact that the contrary has constantly been proven true. Okay, the United States government has been in worse debt before, during World War II. Okay, debt to GDP does not equate to a collapsed economy. Greece and the United States, funnily enough, are very different countries. They have very different economic realities that are made up of very different people. And trying to confuse the Greek government with the U.S. government is laughable, seeing as the Greek government can't even print its own currency. It's trapped in the EU. Now, I'm going off a little bit here, but this is my point. This is one of the reasons why I get frustrated when I hear people say, we got to watch out for radicalism, because what radical is to the establishment might seem completely rational to you. And this is why we need to break the mold of establishment politics, because it's not protecting me and you. It's not protecting the rational status quo. It's protecting just the status quo. It's protecting the corporate interests, the moneyed interest that exists in our politics today. That's not a conspiracy theory. All you have to do is look at the last vote where Cory Booker and a lot of Democrats flipped and voted with the pro-corporate Republicans to prevent the United States from purchasing drugs from Canada. Why did he do that? Well, he did that because it was in his corporate donors' interests to make sure that didn't happen. Because if that happened, that meant that they would have to lower the price of their drugs, and they'd have to cut their bottom line, and they'd now actually have to compete in an open market on the price of their drugs. They wouldn't have a monopoly. They wouldn't have a stranglehold on this. And the only industry that seemed to be really for that was the pharmaceutical industry. Because if you're an insurance company, if your customers have access to cheaper but as equally effective medication, you'd want them to get that. Why? Because it saves you money. Okay? This is the problem with establishment politics. That seems completely rational if you're Cory Booker. This seems completely rational if you're an establishment Democrat or establishment Republican, because you're protecting the status quo. You're doing your job. You're maintaining this rational middle that you believe exists, even though all the objective evidence out there points to the contrary. Now, I seem a little more... this issue really, frustrates me, because it is a frustrating concept. You're constantly having to remind people that are, Democratic cheerleaders and Republican cheerleaders that they're cheerleading for, teams that aren't doing anything for them. They're cheerleading for teams that aren't interested in their welfare and interested in their corporate boss's welfare. They're not interested in seeing your communities develop and thrive. In fact, the resources that used to go into your communities have now been stripped from your communities because it's convenient for them. It makes sense to do it that way because, Who cares about your streets? It's just streets. Just as long as you're able to drive on it, it's fine. And that's the idea that exists in neoliberal politics. The establishment is not forcing the dues to be paid to maintain a stable democracy. And so that's why you're seeing the rise of the alt-right in the United States, and why neo-Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan are coming out of the woodwork, because, the situation's ripe for them. People are looking for a narrative, an explanation for why the situation is the way it is. And this failed idea that people are in these positions because they're just losers, or stupid, or didn't work hard enough, or lazy, doesn't fly. Because, you know what? These are people that are hardworking people. Americans work longer hours than any other group of people on the face of the planet. More of us are trying to work. We want to work. We want to make a living. So if you make that argument, all you're basically doing is spitting in the eyes of people who are already kind of frustrated with you. So it's not surprising that you're seeing the rise of neo-nationalism and neo-Nazism and the rise of redemptionism with the Ku Klux Klan, because you know what? It's an explanation for the shitty situation that people are in. And it's also the reason why you're seeing the rise of anarcho-syndicalism and communism and more radical socialism in the Western world, because, once again, people want an explanation for why things are happening the way they are. So some of the reasons why the Justice Democrats, people like me, are out there is because we're trying to make an argument, you know what, don't adopt these really radical hardline positions, because we've seen what's happened before with that. Let's adopt a pluralist perspective and end this centristic nonsense. Let's be objective. Let's look at things with facts. Let's open our eyes and our minds to multiple schools of thought. And then we make decisions based off of rational thought and discourse. We debate each other. We negotiate with each other. And we understand each other. Now, I want you guys to ask yourself, does that sound more reasonable than putting a swastika on your face, swearing Heil Hitler, and hoping for the Fourth Reich? I think so. And I think that's what most Americans want. But the establishment Democrats and the establishment Republicans don't want Justice Democrats. They don't want Nazis, and they don't want, radical socialists and communists. And the reason why they don't want these things is because it's a threat to their bottom line. So even good reform that might stabilize our economy and stabilize our society and rescind and recede the amount of alt-righters and hardcore radicals in this country is not good for them, because then they are marginalized. And this great center that they all fall in love with, that they all believe in, and they're all basically paid to believe, is now threatened because of that. This is the same reason why the Tea Party, which originally started out as a completely rational movement in my mind, the tax enough already crowd were not people who said that, tax us less. They're basically making the argument that their tax money was going into places that they weren't concerned with. Our tax money, we spent more on bailing out Wall Street that year than we did in the Iraq War. Now, I want people to think about that for a second. And that's why the Tea Party started. Now, what happened to the Tea Party? It got hijacked. It got taken over. Very quickly, people who were part of the Tea Party movement were bought out by corporate America, and the Tea Party is just as establishment as they've come. So one of the things that the Justice Democrats, what we're trying to do is we're trying to learn what happened to the Tea Party. We're trying to look back in history and see where these reform movements went wrong and why they were marginalized. And so we don't make the same mistakes twice. And one of the biggest things is corporate money. So, like I said, I've thrown a lot of information in this. And I'm going to be talking more about this idea of the false equivalence of centrism and the danger that it poses. Because what you're seeing now is that our media is not willing to challenge political figures when they're just dead wrong. They're allowed to lie. They're allowed to lie, and the media allows them to do it because if they challenge them, then the president might not come onto their television show and, be on their show, or a senator or a representative that they want to come onto their show won't show up because, you're mean to them and you actually held them accountable for their actions. Now, if that sounds crazy to you, it is. And so if we don't fix this problem, you're not going to see a rise of a more rational, more sane third party. What you're going to see is a rise of a hardcore, alt-right, neo-national, neo-Nazi, redemptionist party. And you're going to see the rise of a more radical, socialist, communist, anarcho-syndicalist party. Why? Because we've seen this before. This happened before, when our world was basically rattled by economic depression and economic instability. And these are still the ideologies that exist in our world. So I'm not saying support Justice Democrats, otherwise we're going to have Nazism. What I'm saying is support Justice Democrats, so at least we can break this false centrism and actually get more people talking to one another and forming rational opinions and having an objective perspective on the world. I don't expect the Justice Democrats to be, make up 70% of Congress next year or the year following that. What I want is a more pluralistic perspective when it comes to the idea of American politics. I want people to have more alternative views. Okay, the alt-right, I don't necessarily agree with them. In fact, a lot of their opinions I disagree with. But you know what? Just because I disagree with them doesn't mean I don't think that they're all 100% wrong on every single issue. What they're wrong on is issues of race, issues of sex, and issues of, I think, a lot of foreign policy issues. But a lot of alt-righters talk about wanting to fix bridges. I want to fix bridges. Alt-righters want to talk about fixing our infrastructure. I want to fix up our infrastructure. This is the point of being a rational adult. You need to understand that forming coalitions is not easy. Negotiating people is not easy. I don't want to negotiate and I don't want to talk to Nazis. I don't want to talk to Ku Klux Klan members and Southern redemptionists. I don't want to do that. But this is the nature of our politics now. So if we want to get rid of Southern redemptionists and Ku Klux Klan members and neo-Nazis and halt the rise of neo-nationalism, what we need to do is we need to reach out to the people that are appealed to these positions, who are mainstream people who are just pissed off and frustrated at the nature of their politics and the condition that their communities are in, and get them to understand why the alt-right and why neo-Nazism and why redemptionism is wrong. And why these are really stupid ideas in the long run. Because they're not based off of reality. They're based off of the same basis of opinion. They believe they're right. They don't have any evidence to prove that they're right, but they believe they're right. And they're more interested in poking at your emotions, at your emotions, at your emotional responses. The radical socialists and communists and people on the far left that are rising up, they're equally ridiculous because they don't have any viable form of government that they're talking about. They're talking about creating a socialized society, some kind of workers' paradise. A dictatorship of the proletariat. Well, the key word in that is dictatorship. I don't agree with that. But this is the point of having a pluralistic system in place. Now, I've went all over the place in this video, and maybe it's because I'm a little hyped up about what I've been seeing in the media lately. But this is the point. We need to be rational. Conservatives, I don't think conservatives are all unrational. I disagree with them on points, but I agree with them on some points. Okay? That's fine. That doesn't make me a traitor to the cause. That makes me a rational human being. The cause should not be implementing our ideological purity no matter the cost, because we've seen what happens with that. That's not acceptable. It's like, Donald Trump. I disagree with Donald Trump on almost all his issues, but he was against TPP. And he got rid of TPP. Okay, cool. We don't have TPP now. Now, it doesn't mean there's not going to be a trade deal coming down the road that he might agree with that's just as bad as TPP. But you know what? I'm that kind of person. I want to be a rational person. I want to be objective. I want us to take a look at these candidates and take a look at these parties and their platforms and ask ourselves with logic in mind, with objective knowledge in mind, to methodically go through these things and ask ourselves how we can implement these things. Bypassing the politicians. Screw the senators and screw the representatives. They're not interested in you. They're not interested in their platform. They're interested in the centrist establishment, the status quo that they're in love with, because it makes them rich, it makes them influential, it makes them powerful. So, like I said, I've been all over the place in this video. Feel free to comment on it. Let me know what you think. And also comment on videos you'd like to hear from me, and other topics you'd like to hear from me. And once again, thanks for watching. Have a good day.